Let's get to Romans. So Romans, and it's what we call simply Romans because people are usually intimidated by Romans because it's too complex. It's not. It's actually pretty simple. And let me do a quick review because we did skip a week last week. Chapters 1 through 8, as I've said before, are this all by themselves a nice compact, well, they're not compact, it's 8 chapters, but it's a compact description of the problem of man and God's solution. All of us, Jews and Gentiles alike, have sinned against God. Graciously, God has offered a solution to our self-made mess. And then once accepted, we are instantly made right with God, and we're changed now and forever. That's what chapters 1 through 8 are all about. So you're thinking, well, I don't have to read it now. No, really, go back and read it. It's pretty awesome. So that's 1 through 8. But then he gets to chapter 9, 10, and 11, which is where we're in the middle right now. And he raises this issue. So what happened to the Jews? You know, if that's the plan, that's always been the plan, and the Jews missed Jesus, what did they get wrong? And he includes this not for our historical edification. He includes this because we'll do the same thing if we're not careful. So again, don't point too strongly at the Jews for missing Jesus and missing the right way in salvation, because the same way that they'll do it, we tend to as well. Why? Because we're Jews? No, because we're human beings. So anyway, that's where we're at. So he's answering the question, so what happened to the Jews? And he started to answer that because we got through chapter 9, and he said basically a summary in chapter 10, verse 3, is they did not submit to God's righteousness as opposed to their own self-made righteousness. And he talks more about that in chapter 10 and a little bit in 9. In fact, what they tried to do for their righteousness, they relied on their ancestry. Does ancestry, you know, I'm from the Jews, do it? And Paul just radically says in chapter 9, no, for not all who are descended from Israel belong to Israel. What? And not all are children of Abraham because they are his offspring. So he's saying, even if you have the blood of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in your bones, it doesn't count anything towards salvation. And yet, at the time of Jesus, that was a huge factor in the Jews' thinking, okay? And he just says it very clearly there. Not all who are descended from Israel are actually Israel. Wow, crazy. So if it's not ancestry, what else were they doing? Well, they said it was ancestry plus achievements. So it's where you come from plus what you achieve. And Paul put down the achievement thing. And for them, it was achievement in terms of obeying the law. Obey the law, obey the law. Know the law, obey the law. And then Paul says here in chapter 10, verse 4, Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. So he makes this huge thing about, no, the Jews were wrong because they had a self-made righteousness based A, on their ancestry, B, on their ability to do the law. And he has systematically in this section in chapters 9 and part of 10 said, nope, that doesn't work at all, at all. Go back and read chapters 1 through 8, he says, and you'll see what I'm talking about. So we're in the middle of this section right now about all of this. So it's not those things. It's actually, he says, totally God's sovereign mercy that depends on where we end up in eternity. Period. And I redefine these because the word sovereign we don't use too much, and mercy we sort of semi-understand. But if you put it in simpler language, it's God's ruling choice. So it's God's ruling choice, or you can even say overruling choice. It's God's choice of you. That is the determiner about where you'll spend eternity. Now, of course, when we looked at that, we said, well, but wait a second. What about me? Don't I have a say in this? And that question raised, and that's the question we're going to try and put to bed today. Have we no say in the matter? Is it really just God and not me that determines where I spend eternity? Is it really just God's ruling choice? Don't I have to do something? Well, let's take a look and see if we can answer that a little bit today, because we're going to be in chapter 10, and he's going to hit on this pretty cool. Let me just go back a little bit. The last time we looked at this, he said this in verse 12 in chapter 10. There is no distinction between Jew and Greek, for the same Lord is Lord of all, bestowing his riches on all who call on him. So there is a little bit that we have to do. It's not earning salvation, but there is a response that we have to make, calling. And he reinforced this by quoting from the Old Testament, from Joel, verse 13, everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. That's Joel 2:32. And that's also the same verse that Peter uses, and he quotes in his gigantic sermon in the beginning of Acts. And he quotes that. All those who call upon the Lord will be saved. So there's an issue about calling on the Lord. There's an issue about calling out for help. And we'll see what that's all about. So that's where we left it. So today we pick up verse 14 and we continue his thought. So he says, So how then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? So if you don't believe that God can do this for you on your behalf, then you're not going to call on him. And I thought, is there a good illustration of this? Well, yes, there is. Imagine that you're in water in the ocean and you're treading water, okay? And somehow you just found yourself there. Don't ask me how you got there. You people, just go with me here. So you're in the middle, you're treading water in the middle of the ocean, and as you're out there, you're thinking, gee, what are the top issues that affect my ability to survive this, right? And 3 things came to my mind as I'm out there. Number 1, treading water. Number 2, fish, food. And number 3, boats. Those would be the things that come to my mind. And as I'm thinking about that treading water, I'd say, so how good am I at treading water? And I'd say, well, better than most people.
Not yet.
Yeah?
The second, if there is no fish, no boats, what they're going to do?
If there's no fish and no boats,
What are you going to do?
we'll answer that. That's right. But even in fish food, like I'm in an ocean full of fish. Maybe they'll look up and see these wiggling feet while I'm treading water, and I'll become fish food. So treading water, I'm better than most people. So that's good. I might survive because I know a lot of people who tread water worse than I do, and they'd be gone already. So I'm doing pretty good. I'm better than most people. Fish food, well, fish food, humans taste bad to sharks, so I'll be okay. And you can hear the wishful thinking start to creep in. Okay, fish food. How about boats? Well, as I think about it, boats, they float very well. So if I see one, I'll call out to one if one of them shows. That's what I'll do. So I'll tread water here because I'm relatively good at it. Sharks don't like the taste of humans, although they do have to taste first. I'll forget about that. And then boats, if I see a boat, I'll know that I can signal them and I'll be saved if I see a boat. That seems like a good way to get saved out of my situation. Oh, and there's a fourth thing. Mermaids, they help people all the time. So wishful thinking starts to creep in. So you're out there and you're in this desperate situation. You're better than most treading water. You're pretty sure the sharks aren't going to eat you. Pretty sure, not sure. May taste, may not eat, who knows. Boats, if a boat shows up, that's a good piece of salvation because they float. I don't float, but a boat does. And mermaids, they're everywhere. They'll help me. And so you tread water. Now this is your mindset as you're out there treading water. And then one day, you look up in the sky and you see something flying around. Go, hey, what's that? And then it gets closer and it flies past. Hey, I know what that is. Yeah, it's a helicopter. And then suddenly you find it hovering right over the top of you, and a guy sticks his head out of the side of the helicopter and he says, need some help? Now you're thinking through treading water, fish food, boats, mermaids. Helicopters were on my list. So let me think about helicopters for a second. Treading water, fish food, boats, and helicopters. Oh, you know what? They don't float very good, so they're bad. It's not exactly the kind of salvation you were thinking about. It's in a different dimension almost. And so when he says you need some help, you say, nah, I'm good. Because you know that if you succumb to his lie, the helicopter's just going to hit the water and sink and you're all going to die. So you wave him off. So how will they call on him in whom they have not believed? How will you call on a helicopter to help you if you don't believe a helicopter can help you? So how do you fix the problem? Have them send a boat. I'll be here all day, send a boat, and I'll climb in the boat. Well, this is where Paul's going. He's saying basically they need to call on God for their salvation. They need to call on him, but first they have to believe that there is salvation from him or they won't call on him, right? Just like you won't take advantage of the helicopter unless you believe that there's real salvation there. If you saw a boat, your preconceived notion of salvation, you'd climb into that, but a helicopter, I don't know, right? So
Wave both hands.
you wave both hands, yeah. After you believe, you can be helped. So you call after you believe, and this is what Paul's saying. There's an understanding problem you have to get over before you call. And he'll talk about this later, but this is essentially the problem that the Jews have, is because they believed in ancestry and achievements. They didn't see that they really needed to call on God for anything special for their salvation because they had it all figured out. So they didn't believe that they needed salvation through Christ's payment. Belief is the problem. Belief is the problem. Same thing happened to the Jews when they left Egypt in the Exodus. They go across the desert. And in a number of weeks, they come up to the edge of the promised land. Who made the promise? God made the promise. They come up to the promised land. They look at it. Moses says, let's send some guys in just to spy in the land, come back and bring him a report. Maybe that'll be encouraging to everybody. They come back, and 10 out of the 12 spies say, there's giants in the land. We can't do this. Well, and the other 2 said, well, you're right, there are giants, but God's gianter than the giants. So we need just to trust, because God made a promise for the promised land. I think he's got this. And they said, no, let's go back to Egypt. And the writer of Hebrews and other places says that they failed to make it into the promised land because they didn't believe that God could do what he promised. Belief was the problem that kept them from salvation in the promised land. And belief is the fundamental problem that keeps the Jews from calling out to God. And lack of belief is what causes us to never call out to God. So you got to believe. So how do you fix belief? This is what he's going to talk about. If I'm going to trust in a piece of salvation that I never anticipated, I need to be educated. So he says, and how are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? So you fix belief by hearing about more information. So, if the guy leaning out of the helicopter could say, why won't you let me help you? Well, because helicopters sink in the water. Well, we're not going to go into the water. Why? Because we have these blades that go around, they'll keep us out of the water. We don't want to go in the water either. We can pull you up here, and it'll be safe for you, and you'll never hit the water again. You're right, helicopters don't float, but they fly. You educate the guy in the water. And then he says, well, okay, maybe. So education, hearing leads to believing, and then believing leads to calling, right? Makes a lot of sense. This is all really practical. And then he says, and how are they to hear without someone preaching? Well, that's really good, because someone has to go to them and tell them this information. And this information will then build into belief, and then belief will build into a trust to call. So that makes sense too. So someone's got to preach. And that's what Paul's doing in his ministry right now, even as he writes Romans. He's traveling around and bringing this information about this unusual salvation that God has provided for us through Christ. It flies, it doesn't float. It's different in that sense. So that's what he's doing. He's preaching to them. How will they hear without someone preaching? And then he says in verse 15, and how are they to preach unless they're sent? So someone has to be sent to them, because they're not going to send people back to find out what they don't know to even ask about. So you have to send those who are sent, that's like Paul, preach, and because of what they preach, people hear, and they understand what they hear, and they believe, and then they put their trust in God, and they call out for him to help. And then it fulfills the Joel 2 passage. All those who call upon the name of the Lord, that's his reputation, will be saved. But you got to call on him to do it. It's a helicopter salvation. It's not a boat salvation. As it is written, he says, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news. And if you're like me, you're saying, shouldn't that be, how beautiful are the lips of those who bring good news? That doesn't sound right. But he didn't quote the entire passage. It comes out of Isaiah, and this is really the image that a Jew would hear when he hears this quoted by Paul. He'd see a guy hiking over the mountains, because the original passage in Isaiah 52:7, Paul did a shorthand quote. Here's the longhand quote. How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news. So see, at the time, you didn't have newspapers or the internet or Google. So when you had news from other places far away, you had to wait until someone wrote something on a piece of paper, gave it to a messenger, and he hiked across the mountain until he got to you. So that's always been the image, and it's accentuated by the fact that there's a barrier between you and where the action's going on. So someone, if they really want to get the news to you, they'll go, it's like the mailman kind of quote, neither hail nor sleet, nor I forget how the rest of it goes. But in this case, neither mountain ranges or whatever, we're going to get the news to you. We're going to work hard to get past all the things that are between me and you to understanding the truth, and we're going to get it to you. We're going to walk across the mountains on our bare feet, and we're going to come. And then as you're in the needy place where you look up on the mountains and you see this guy coming down the mountainside, and you realize he's a messenger, you think, they're bringing news. They're bringing news to us. We're filing news. And as you open up the news that he brings you, it's good news. So how lovely on the mountains are the feet of those who bring good news, because they worked hard to send and bring it to you. And Paul's saying that's the issue. We have to send people with good news and forget about the impasses of the mountains between us and them. We have to say that doesn't matter. The news is that worthwhile. They take the news, how beautiful it is that your feet are on the mountains just going past all these horrible roadblocks, bringing us the good news. And the good news leads us to belief, and the belief leads us to trusting and calling on him. Now, those of us in the Christian community say, well, duh. That's what evangelism is. And evangelism, the word itself, is a transliteration of the Greek. And the two parts of the Greek word, euangelos, EU, actually comes out to be EV when you translate here. Eu means good. If you give a eulogy at a funeral, it's good words. Eulogy. And then the angelos is message. It's the same word we get angels from. Angelos, angels. So it's a good message. It's a good message. It's good news. Evangelism is bringing good news. So how beautiful on the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news. That's what we're doing. We're bringing good news to those who don't understand. So here's the people. This is where they are, where they need good news. They're treading water. And they're hoping in mermaids to help them when everything else fails. They're hoping in fiction. That's what they are. They need some practical, real relief from the weight of their sin. They need some way to find themselves out of this. How are we going to do this? How will they ever call on the helicopter? How will they ever call on God to help them? They've got to understand. So we're going to send people. We're going to preach to them. They're going to hear. They're going to believe. And once they believe, they're going to call on God and say, well, this is a great solution. It's a great solution. But it takes education. You got to know. You got to know what's going on. That's what we're doing. But they have not all obeyed the gospel. Talking about the Jews. They haven't all responded to the good news, the euangelos. They haven't obeyed that. They haven't taken advantage of this great opportunity, he says in verse 16. For Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed what has heard from us, what he has heard from us? Who has believed? And this is a theme through most of the major prophets in the Old Testament. God called these guys to send, to preach so that they would hear and they would believe. And they went out, these guys. Isaiah was not received well. Legend tells us he was sawn in two while he was inside a log. They weren't received well. And Isaiah says, who's received our report? Rhetorically speaking, they're not listening. Well, to be fair, God called many of these major prophets at the beginning of their ministries and said, I want you to speak for me, but they're not going to listen to you. Well, then why are we doing this? Well, because they need to hear. Some will respond. So I'm sending you to preach so that they'll hear and they'll understand and they'll call upon my name. That's the whole process. This, by the way, is a quote from Isaiah 53, which I read for you this morning. It's at the beginning of the very famous messianic chapter in Isaiah that so clearly describes Jesus. So clear. It's verse 1 of that chapter. So he's saying, and Paul's quoting it in that chapter, he says, they're not going to believe. What are they not going to believe? Read the rest of Isaiah 53. All we like sheep have gone astray, and each of us has turned to his own way, but the Lord has caused the iniquity of us all to fall on him. Now that's helicopter salvation. That's not boat salvation. See? It's very different. It's what you would not expect. So at the beginning of Isaiah 53, Isaiah says, who has believed what they heard from us? And again, the problem is belief. They heard, but they didn't believe. And that's the problem the Jews have at the time of Jesus. And that's the problem we have until we hear and believe and put our trust in him. They have not believed. So he says in verse 17 a remarkable thing. So faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. Famous verse. We quote this a lot. This is probably in the top 5 verses quoted in Romans. So faith comes by hearing, and hearing comes through the word of Christ. But he never mentioned faith in this. You notice that? He hasn't used the word faith at all in this section. But he's telling us something about faith, because faith is actually those 3 things altogether. It's a process. Faith in its fundamental word in Greek, the way it was used before the New Testament, was used in a courtroom scene. So when people would give testimony about what someone has or hasn't done, if you became persuaded by what you heard, that was this word pistis. That was this word that ends up being translated faith or belief, half and half of the New Testament. So really, this is basically a word that says, I heard and I believed. And faith is one step past just believing. It's also taking action, calling. So that's probably, if you're looking for a good definition of faith, there it is right there, because that's how we quote it. You hear, you believe, and you act. You call because of what you understand. You put your trust in what you hear in terms of the one who promises helicopter salvation instead of boat salvation. So that's it. And so, by the way, just looking at that, we can understand the misunderstandings of faith. Faith is not a blind faith. And most people in secular society who look at people who are religious say, you believe in blind faith. That is, no evidence. No evidence. So you say, well, I don't have any good reason to expect this is going to happen, so I guess I'll just have to have faith because I don't have any evidence. No, that's not biblical faith. According to Paul, it starts with hearing. That's information. Faith is based on understanding, which leads to belief, which leads to calling out to God. Faith in the Bible is always evidence-based. Always, always, always. So don't let anyone out there tell you faith is just believing in something when you don't have the evidence for it. No, it's not. It starts with evidence, and faith is a way to extend that evidence to what you can't see and which it has not happened yet. That's what it says in Hebrews 11. So don't let them say that. So it's not blind faith. It's founded on facts. It's what we hear. It enables trust because what's in what we hear enables us to trust God's solution to our problem. And it results eventually in our calling out for help. So many times pisteuo, when it's translated in the New Testament, is believe. And then many times it's faith. When you see in believe, it's the hear and believe. When it's faith, it's hear, believe, and call. It results in an action. So that's just simply what it is. There it is. How simple can it get? And also, and this is really important, it vacates our works in preference for Christ's work. And now that's super important because what we hear that leads us to belief is all the amount of treading water you can do, even if you're better than most, is not going to save you. That's what you hear. So what do you need to do? If you're going to be saved from an unexpected salvation from above, you have to give up treading water in place of a salvation from someone else. Someone else's work for you, not your work for you. That's where faith leads us. So that's why I say it vacates our works in preference of his works. Somewhere when you're in the middle of that ocean and you're desperate and things are going bad, you have to say, I need to choose. Do I want to continue to tread water, or is there a way that I can trust someone else's superior work on my behalf? Faith always trades works for works. And the person's work that we put our faith and trust in is Christ's work for us. So that's what faith leads to. Faith is to say, it's not me. I'm going to stop treading water and hoping in mermaids. I'm going to put my trust in the revealed, founded truth of who Christ is and what he's done on my behalf. You trade one work for the other. That's why, it's very, very simple. I was talking to a friend this week. He says, I have an absolute test for whether someone's a Christian. Scott and I were sitting with him, and we looked at each other. An absolute test? Like a litmus paper, An absolute test that they're Christian? How do you do that? He says, well, I asked them, when they die and they find themselves on the verge of heaven and, the Peter at the gate thing, which is totally fiction, but let's just go with that for a second. And you're asked, why should I let you into heaven? And the person says, well, I've been treading water pretty well for most of my life. Then they didn't make the trade and they don't have faith. It's really simple. It's on the basis of Christ's work. So here you are with him hovering over you like that. And all you have to do is say help. That's the call. All those who call upon the name of the Lord will be saved. By the way, the name of the Lord, not just call on the Lord, the name is the reputation that you come to understand. You understand that he's a loving God, that he's a capable God, that he loves you even despite your unworthiness for his love. You understand all these things, the name of the Lord, his reputation, and what he can do on your behalf. And you say, great, I'm going to give up treading water right now, and if you don't save me, I'm going to drown. And he lifts you out. And it's only, you don't have to say to him, Lord, help me to tread water a little bit longer and give superior strength to my muscles, because with your help I can be here forever with your help helping me doing this treading water thing. And oh God, by the way, there's sharks out here, so can you tell the sharks supernaturally that I'm not really good fish food, and I think I'll do okay if you give me supernatural strength to tread water and the sharks stay away, and then if you want to send a boat, that'd be great, but you don't have to because I think we got this. So God, will you help me too? Is not a good prayer. God, help means that everything I've been doing won't get me there. That's the best prayer in the entire Bible. God, help. And all those who call on the name of the Lord will be saved. It's him that does it, not us. That's exactly what that means. Help. And then as soon as you say help, guess what happens? Oh, this thing starts coming down out of the helicopter. and shark cage. He answered my prayer to protect me from the sharks. It's a shark cage. No. But this comes down. In fact, that's not a bad illustration of the fact that we really misunderstand the nature of salvation until you get close to it. And this thing comes into the water, and the guy up in the helicopter says, climb into that and we'll haul you up. And now you think to yourself, treading water, fish food, boats, helicopters sink. This is looking okay. But climb into a basket? I fully believe helicopters can fly, and I firmly believe that basket can hold me, and I firmly believe that steel wire going up to the helicopter will hold me. I firmly believe all of those things, but I'm not climbing in. Well, then, do you firmly believe? No. That's why an action results from faith. That's the call part. So something has to follow through. And if you don't follow through, that's God's way of saying to yourself, maybe you don't really believe. My dad designed aeronautic. He had an aeronautical engineering degree, and one of his first jobs, 2 jobs that he ever had, was helping with 2 helicopter companies build helicopters right after the war. And I asked him, what's it like to fly in a helicopter? He says, I don't know. Well, you work for 2 helicopter companies and you never flew in a helicopter? Oh, no. If you knew what was in a helicopter, you wouldn't get in one either. Well, he had knowledge, and he believed what was inside a helicopter, but he didn't have the faith to climb in one. He was fully informed, too. And that's the whole thing. When you put your trust in something after you learn about the thing and understand it can accomplish for you what you want, if you're not taking the step, then you don't have faith. And that's what's behind James's comment in the book of James. It's exactly, here's some passages right here. James 2:17. So also, faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. If I have faith in the helicopter and faith in the basket and faith in the cable, but I don't work, if I don't climb into the basket, then my faith is dead. In fact, my faith is deadly because I won't really put my trust. There's something James is saying that when I see that you understand a truth, in this case, the salvation that comes through Christ's sacrifice, when you understand the truth and you're willing to believe that it'll be efficacious, it'll be effective for you, if you still don't take a step, then your faith is not there. It's not real faith. It's not real faith. But it's demonstrated when you climb in the basket. And many of us have climbed in the basket. And it puts us out of control, by the way. It means we no longer can chart our ability to tread water. It means we no longer can try and scare away the sharks. And we're out of control. Now we're in a basket, on a cable, to a helicopter, and we are totally passive in our salvation. Yes. So it's understanding the entire rescue effort. And salvation comes from the word rescue, to be taken from a confined space and put in an open space. So we really need to understand. God does not want you to choose Christ in your salvation if you don't understand what it's all about. He wants you to understand. He wants you to understand to the degree that you will vacate your own works in preference for his work for you. And you have to understand, even when I came to Christ, and I was making this decision, I was thinking, well, God, I think I'll choose to follow you, or I'll be part of whatever plan you have. But it sure would make me feel more comfortable and in control if you told me where we're going and what's going to happen. Because then I can make a more reasoned choice. Well, now, there's a piece of information that he deliberately withheld. Because he knew I couldn't handle the truth. If I knew I was going to be here 45 years later, I would have said no. Because you guys are all scary. Probably there's things about that stuff. But all he said, all you need to know is I'll be with you. And you know something about me? And even my knowledge of who he was and his love for me, it was supernatural. I really don't know where that came from. But I knew it well enough to say, I'll climb in the basket and let you take me where you want to take me. Because I think you love me more than I love myself. So that's faith that takes a step to call and respond. It's a perfect illustration. James also said earlier in later I should say, 2:18, I will show you my faith by my works. Now this is not a works versus faith. He's just saying that faith, where you hear and you believe and you entrust, has got to show up somehow on the outside of your life. It's got to. If it doesn't, it's all words. If it doesn't, you're asking God to give you supernatural strength to tread water, and that's not his idea of salvation. Or you're constantly looking for a salvation that looks like a boat instead of the one he really brought, which is from above. It's a totally different affair. So I'll show you my faith. If you want to know if I have faith, look at what I do. Look at what I do. I say this all the time, and I think this every time I climb on a jet plane. You know, you're on the jetway and you're walking, and there's that last step where you suddenly step inside the plane. You know, if I don't make that step, then I don't trust that plane safe. Although all the evidence tells me it is, and all the evidence tells me that the pilots are pretty good, but if I don't make that step, then I don't have faith in the plane. So it always results in an action of entrusting. Always does. Is it something you take credit for in eternity? No. If you were floating in that sea and the helicopter came, would you take credit for the fact, yeah, well, I was, treading water one day and this helicopter came and I was smart enough to say, hey, can you help me? And so he pulled me out of the water and it was really all me. I'm pretty smart and I can recognize salvation way. No, you're never going to do that because you realize that everything you could possibly do was going to get you killed. And salvation is only from him. He came and hovered over my life and said, I'm bringing to you a salvation that you would never expect. And what you're going to have to do is walk away from treading water and trust me. Are you willing to do that? The credit's all his. It'll never be mine. So even in this, people debate, well, is me calling out, is that a work? Well, it's only a work if you're earning something. And when you receive God's grace, it's never earning his grace. It's just accepting. It's just accepting. And God's the one who chose, before the beginning of the universe, to send a helicopter to hover over you. And it's not you. It's not you. And you'll never take credit for it. So it's not a work if you can't earn it. Well, let's push on. He keeps going. So what went wrong with the Jews? Why didn't they figure this out? I mean, the immediate thing is you look at the list and say, oh, well, here's the thing. Maybe they didn't hear. Maybe they didn't understand. Maybe they really didn't hear about Christ and who he's all about. So Paul says in verse 18, but I ask, he's anticipating your question, have they not heard? Well, indeed they have. For, and he quotes again from the Old Testament, their voice has gone out to all the earth and their words to the ends of the earth, and in fact, of the world. In fact, this is the psalm that starts with, the heavens declare the glory of God. So he's saying, did they hear? Yes. They have been served notice. They know. They can't get to the gates of heaven and say, oh, he didn't know. They know, he's saying. And in the beginning of Romans, he says everybody knows. Everyone is without excuse. How? Well, through nature and through creation. There's something about it that's compelling that draws us to the fact that there is a God, there is a creator. Now, a lot of secular people today would argue with that. Say, I don't think so. I don't think it's compelling. But the interesting thing is in the history of all mankind on the earth, you look at anthropology, cultures create myths about the existence of a God all the time. And it's not because they don't think God exists. They do think God exists because they see things in creation that clearly is beyond man to do. This has been the common thought in most cultures, almost all worldwide through the history of man. There is a God, then they just debate in their ignorance about who this God is. But they don't debate about whether there's a God until you get postmodern 21st century. And then we say, there is no God. And the writer of the Psalm says, that you're a fool if you believe that. Because there's evidence. And Paul starts Romans 1 saying there's evidence. So did the Jews know? Yes. The Jews knew. They got Psalm 19:4. And he goes on with this. Maybe they just didn't believe. Maybe there wasn't enough information to believe. 19. But I ask, did Israel not understand? Maybe they just didn't understand what they heard. Well, he quotes again, Old Testament. Moses says, I will make you jealous of those who are not a nation. With a foolish nation, I will make you angry, from Deuteronomy 32. So what's he saying? Well, the nation that's not a nation that they're going to be jealous of is us. Is us. So what Paul is saying through what God has quoted, written here, is the fact that God's going to finally get the news through to their understanding by having them look at a people who were not a people, who've been made the people of God, and who have life from this God, Creator, Redeemer. And they're going to look and they're going to be jealous. They're finally going to recognize that this is a really good deal. It's the same thing as if two of you were treading water in the water, and one of you gets hauled up, and as you get hauled up, the one that's left in the water says, hey, maybe I need to rethink this because he's got life and I'm going to die. Jealousy. That's what this is all about. So he's saying they'll get it, and you know what? Part of the message to them will be the Gentiles. The Gentiles will get it. And he's already talked about this. And that itself will tend to give them, will serve notice to them that they've found life through this God that they denied. And he goes on, verse 20, then Isaiah is so bold to say, I have been found by those who did not seek me. I have shown myself to those who did not ask for me. Again, who are those people? The Gentiles. They didn't ask for me, but they found me anyway. When Paul goes to Athens in his ministry in Acts, you see him get to this very intellectual center in Athens, and he gives a presentation. And he basically says that this God, this unknown God that you don't know, I'm here to tell you all about him. I've been sent here. I'm going to preach to you. You're going to hear, and then you'll believe, and then you'll know you need to call on his name. I've been here to tell you about this unknown God. And that's what he does. And if you do believe, the people who didn't ask for me seek me. They didn't seek me, but they found me anyway. And Paul says in Athens, they'll grope around and eventually find him because he's near. 21. But of Israel, he says, all day long I've held out my hands to a disobedient and contrary people. Isaiah 65. Now, most Jews would read that and say, well, he's talking about the Gentiles. No, he's talking about you, buddy. He's talking about the Jews. And God has held out his hands to you for how long can I say? You read Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and these guys. This is God holding his hand out to these people saying, listen, 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 listen. If you want life, listen. Listen to this. God's saying, I've been holding out my hands and you haven't responded. And that's the Jews. So it's not because they haven't heard. It's not because they misunderstood what they heard. They knew, they understood, they got it. They've been served notice. They are now without excuse. And God has been taking the initiative all this time, holding his hands out to them, and they just did not respond. They wouldn't climb in the basket. And when Jesus comes and says, I'm that basket, they said, no, sorry, we're treading water. And they denied him. But God has not been slow to tell them what's going down. All day long, I've held out my hands to a disobedient and contrary people. And this really rings, too, about the prophets, because this is what the prophets did in the Old Testament. They were sent, they preached, and they heard, but they didn't always respond. Look at, I'm going to quote to you the last dying breath words of Stephen as he's being stoned in Acts 7, first martyr in the Christian church. How he closes out, he does like a 2-page rendition of the history of Israel. And he closes with these words. So watch this. He's telling this to the Jews that are sitting next to him. Which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? And they killed those who announced beforehand the coming of the righteous one. So the prophets that came to old Israel were telling of the righteous one. Who's that? Christ. They told about helicopter salvation, not treading water. They were served notice. And then he goes on. He says, they announced beforehand the coming of the righteous one, whom you have now betrayed and murdered, you who received the law as delivered by angels, but you didn't keep it. And then they killed him. Well, them are killing words right there. Because the Jews prided themselves on treading water, that is, obeying the law. But what Stephen is saying is the law was meant to point you to the righteous one. The unexpected salvation that's not based on your own works of the law. And what happened? God sent you messengers, the prophets all the time, and you just killed them. You killed them. And God continued to send messengers, and you killed them. John the Baptist was the last of that group, and he came preaching, repent, the kingdom of God is near. And they killed him. This message is not really well received in the world. Why? Because it feels better to us to prefer treading water over giving up and putting our trust in someone else's work. We just don't want to do that. And why? The P word. Pride. Pride. You have to be very humble to climb into that basket and say, I'm giving up. And that's what we've done in Christ. Well, we need to kind of wrap things up here. Treading water, well, I'm better than most people. Fish food, well, humans don't taste better. Boats, yeah, they float. I'll call on one of those if it shows up. Mermaids, they always help people. I'm waiting. Helicopters don't float. They're bad. So I'm just going to stay where I am. This is a person who needs to have an understanding of the truth of things and a good understanding about their inability to save themselves, despite the fact that I'm better at this than most. And unfortunately, throughout most of religious mankind, people are walking around saying, I'm better than most, so I have the better chance than most people. Why will God let you into heaven? Because I did my best, and I'm better than Hitler. But it's still treading water. What people need to hear and understand and believe is that there's a basket being lowered from heaven to save you from what you cannot save yourself from. So stop telling yourself these lies. And he's coming at great cost to save you out of what is certain death. But you're going to have to believe that he's capable. You're going to have to believe that in his loving kindness he's done this for you. You're going to have to believe he can do this because you're going to have to vacate your own works in preference for his. Are you willing to give up everything so that you get everything from him? It's not a halfway thing. It's not I do my best and Jesus does the rest. That's an abomination biblically. It's no, I stop and he's everything. That's the message in the Bible, over and over. That was the clear message God gave to the nation of Israel in the Old Testament. That's what Stephen says. They understood, but they didn't get it. They didn't believe. They did not want to believe it. Just like the promised land standing there, and God said, I'm promising you this land. I'm giving this to you. Forget about the giants. I've got this covered. I've got this for you. I made a promise. I can't vacate my promise. It's going to happen. But they wouldn't enter because they wouldn't believe. They wouldn't entrust themselves. Because if you entrust yourself to a God who cannot handle the giants, we're all going to die. Can God handle the giants? Yes. And his promise is good. Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. And all we need to do is say help. And that's what we tell people. And I've often used this illustration of being saved at sea because it really only takes waving your hand and saying, I'm spent. I need salvation from above, not from below. Because the threat is well known. And the more I tread water, the more tired I get, and I see the fish starting to swarm. And it's a bad deal. But all those who call upon the name of the Lord will be saved. Able to save because he loves us, because he's a God of love. He's a God who sent the helicopter exactly over your spot in the sea and said, I'm here to help, but you're going to have to climb in the basket. And this is the God who saves. He's our Redeemer. So let me pray and then we'll sing the song and we'll be done. Father, I still marvel at the day that I saw your helicopter hovering over me. And I was thinking about the waters that I was in and wondering how long I could tread water, wondering how long I'd stay here, and wondered if there was a salvation. And then there you were. There you were. How did you know to find me? How did you know where I was treading water? How did you, out of the entire expanse of the ocean of the universe, know to come and hover over me? And I can't answer those questions. But I do know you did. And on the day that I said, I'm done, I'm yours, and I climbed in your basket, and you swept me away to places yet unknown, I somehow knew, through what your Spirit was telling me, I somehow knew that this was a great God, capable and able to save me, and in whose love I could entrust with abandon. And you've never disappointed. You've never disappointed me. And I look back at climbing in that basket and say, wow, I am so glad I climbed in. So Lord, I pray that you would make that message clear through us. We realize you left us here instead of taking us to yourself when we trusted in you for the purposes of sending and preaching, and so that others can hear and believe and call to you. So Lord, we pray that you would make that message clear through us to those who are struggling in a shifting sea that threatens to envelop them, that you would make clear through us as your Spirit speaks through us the great salvation, so unexpected from above, that hauls us out of that and brings us to you. And brings us to you. So thank you for this great message, and our hearts are eternally grateful, and we'll tell stories about your salvation through the rest of eternity. And that'll delight us all. So thank you for this now in Jesus' name. Amen.